In this final video, we're going to move into the design phase and take a closer look at the VMware Horizon View reference architecture, which is known as the pod and block architecture, that will form the basis of our design. Armed with all these things, we're now going to move into the pilot phase. During the pilot phase, there are 4 steps we're going to work through, starting with the first step, design. The pilot infrastructure should be designed on the same hardware platforms that the production solution is going to be deployed on. For example, the same servers and storage. This takes into account any anomalies between platforms and configuration differences that could affect things such as scalability, or more importantly, performance. Even at the pilot stage, the design is absolutely key, and you should make sure you take into account the production design even at this stage. Why? Basically, because many pilot solutions end up going straight into production, and more users get added above and beyond those scoped for within the pilot. It's great going live with the solution and not having to go back and rebuild it, but when you start to scale by adding more users and applications, you might have some issues due to the pilot sizing. It may sound obvious, but often with a successful pilot, the users just keep on using it and additional users get added. If it's only ever going to be a pilot, that's fine, but keep this in mind and bear this in mind. If you are planning on taking the pilot straight into production, design it for production right at the very start. It is always useful to work from a prerequisite document to understand the different elements that need consideration in the design. The next step is to deploy the pilot. In the deployment phase of the pilot, you are going to start building out the infrastructure, deploying the test users, building the OS images, and then start testing. Next, we start to test the pilot deployment. During the testing phase, you need to work closely with the end users and your sponsors, showing them the solution and how it works, closely monitoring the users and assessing the solution as it's being used. This allows you to keep in contact with the users and give them the opportunity to continually provide real-time feedback. This in turn allows you to answer questions and make adjustments and enhancements on the fly, rather than waiting until the end of the project, only to be told it didn't work or they just simply didn't understand something. This then leads us on to the last step, reviewing the pilot. The final stage sometimes tends to get forgotten. You've deployed the solution, the user's been testing it, and then it ends there for whatever reason. However, there is one very important last thing to do to enable you to move into production. You need to measure the user experience and the IT department's experience against the success criteria that you set out at the start of this process. You need to get customer sign-off and agreement that you have successfully met all the objectives and requirements. If this is not the case, you need to understand the reasons why. Have you missed something in the use case? Have the user requirements changed? Or is it simply a perception issue? Whatever the case, you need to cycle around the process again. Go back to the use case, understand and re-evaluate the user requirements, what it is that is seemingly failing or not behaving as expected, and then tweak the design or make the required changes and get the users to test the solution again. So the first thing to measure is whether or not you have met and demonstrated the success criteria. If the answer to that question is no, then you need to cycle back to your success criteria and make sure you've not missed something. Once you have reviewed the success criteria and made any updates, then work through the pilot phase again until the success criteria have been met. With the success criteria now met, you can answer yes to the question and move on to the next question, user acceptance. If the answer to this question is no, then you need to go back and look at your design and the use cases, update as necessary, and then redeploy to the end users. If you can answer yes to this question, then you can move to the creating of your production and design based on the learnings from the pilot. Now that you've proven that the solution works within your environment, you can take all the findings from both the assessment and the pilot phases and start to build out a design for production. Luckily, VMware has a reference architecture to help with your design. This reference architecture, called the pod and block architecture, allows you to scale out your solution, leaving you with just the sizing of the resources required to host the infrastructure that you need to worry about. When we discussed the infrastructure components in the first section of this volume, we mentioned that there were really 2 sets of infrastructure within it. One to host the virtual desktop machines, and another to host the infrastructure components, such as the connection servers. These form the basis of the pod and block architecture. We're going to start by looking at the desktop block, which is used to host the virtual desktop machines. A Horizon View block is designed to support up to 2,000 users and contains all the infrastructure that is required to resource these virtual desktop machines. The desktop block also contains a vCenter server, ESX host server, networking, and storage. The ESX hosts will need to be sized with enough resources and capacity that is required by the virtual desktop machines. So, enough memory, CPU, and any additional requirements such as GPU cards. So where does a pod come in? Horizon View Pod consists of 5 blocks, or 5 lots of 2,000 users, meaning a single pod can support up to 10,000 users. Next up we have the management block. This contains the infrastructure components such as the connection servers, replica servers and security servers that are required to support the desktop blocks. A management block can consist of up to a total of 7 connection servers. 5 of these support each of the 2,000 users within a desktop block, and the other 2 are for high availability in the event that a connection server fails. As with the desktop block, the management block will have its own ESX host servers, vCenter servers, storage and networking. The vCenter server in the management block is a different instance used just to manage the infrastructure components. Due to the different workload profiles, you would not use this vCenter server to manage the virtual desktop machines. The other components in the management blocks are the ESX servers, networking and storage. Now we've looked at the desktop block and the management block, let's bring the 2 components together to create the View Pod. The View Pod starts with the management block that hosts the View components. We then add up to 5 View blocks, each supporting up to 2,000 users, up to the total of 10,000 supported users per pod. If you need to scale beyond the 10,000 user limit, then you can deploy multiple pods. However, in this configuration, the individual pods do not communicate or share information with each other. They are completely separate sets of infrastructure. That was until the Cloud Pod architecture came along. With the introduction of the Cloud Pod architecture, you can now scale beyond the 10,000 user limit, up to a maximum of 50,000 users across 5 pods. The difference is now that the pods not only replicate information within the same pod, they also share the configuration information across all connection servers in all pods that are configured within the Cloud Pod architecture. The other key difference that the Cloud Pod architecture introduced is high availability, as pods do not necessarily need to be in the same location. In fact, you can configure it so that users can travel between sites, and any desktops they log into are created from the pod or data center that is local to them. In this final part of this section, we're going to take a couple of minutes just to summarize what you have learnt. In section 3, we've learnt firstly how to approach a VDI project, then how to conduct a desktop assessment with Liquidware Labs Stratosphere, and then how to prove the technology by looking at proof of concepts, proof of technologies, and pilots. Then finally, we looked at how to design and deploy a VMware Horizon 7 environment. Now you have that initial design, in the next section we're going to start deploying the Horizon View software.